all this stuff I have makes it look like I'm going to be up here a long time, doesn't it? Don't worry. Don't worry about it. I'm not. Most of y'all know 8-10 weeks ago, thank you, I finally sold the house that we owned on Linden. This was the house that I grew up in, that my mother grew up in, that Amy and her siblings went to see Grandma at, that my grandfather built in 1917, and it had a very, very special place in my heart, in Amy's heart, in the collective Russell heart. But it was time to move on, and time to write another chapter. And so some folks have purchased it, and they're now in the process of making it their home. And my prayer for them, and it's a fervent prayer, is that over the course of however many years they live there, they will find the happiness and the peace and the joy and the contentment and the fun and all of the things that went into 1794 Linden, that when I drive by it, I feel good. And I think when Amy drives by it, she feels good. Because there's a lot there that no matter if my name is no longer on the register of ownership, my heart is still there. Now, I'm going to confess to you a little bit. I'm a tad nosy. And since I sold the house and they took possession of it, almost every Sunday when I leave here or when I come here and on Wednesday night, I just slowly cruise by that house to see, what are you doing, folks, in my house? Are you going to make it look as good as I think it ought to look? Do you want to change it so radically that I won't recognize it? Well, fortunately for them, thus far, they're doing a fine job. And when I drive by at night, it really does feel good to see lights on in the windows, because it was vacant for a long time, a year and a half. And even when, you all know Rose, when Rose lived there, it was not a home. It was just a shell where Rose lived. So today it has become a home for some folks, and I really do hope they get all that I had out of it over the coming years. And as I have driven through there and by there, I've thought about some of the conversations that my mother and I had over the years as I was growing up. And some of the happy conversations, and then some of the confrontations that sons and mothers and daughters and mothers and children and parents have. And probably one of the largest things that my mother and I disagreed on as I became an older child, as I came into my teenage years, as I went to Fairview, as I went to Central, is I wanted to be like everybody else. And I wanted my clothes to look like everybody else. And there were 3 stores down on Union Avenue, Cash and Wright, Julius Lewis, and Imperial Clothiers, that my clothes had to come from. Not to mention the 1-2-3 shop in Goldsmiths downtown. And my shirts, they could not have a little alligator on it. I mean, if I got a shirt for Christmas that didn't have an alligator, I hoped I saved it for Peter, because that's what he deserved. My pants had to have a little tag on them back here that said HIS. Don't remember, who remembers HIS pants? Yeah, some of you, John Johnson does, made up in West Tennessee somewhere. My shoes had to have a little tag on them that said Bass or Ouija. And if I didn't have my alligator, my HIS, or my Bass Weegians on, particularly by the time I got to Central, I just wasn't fully clothed. I really wasn't. And my mother tried so hard, bless her heart, she tried so hard to convince me that what I put on my back and my body didn't have one iota of influence on who I was. But you know, at that point, I was 14 or 15 years old, and I knew everything, and my mother wasn't really but about half bright. And we had some really strong conversations about the clothing that I wear. And the same is today. You know, we're all aware of what we put on, and some of us really want a good name on there. And I think that's normal because it's what people see on the outside. It's part of our facade. But Paul this morning, in his letter to the church at Colossae, talks about that clothing really isn't what makes us who we are. But then he says maybe it is. Maybe you're just picking out the wrong kind of clothes. I should have brought, when I was in Egypt and in Jordan and in Israel this past winter, I brought some native garb. And maybe I should have worn my Galabea this morning. I'm going to wear it one of these days so that you can see the native garb that they wear and that they wore back in Jesus' time. But Paul is talking more than cotton and nylon threading. Paul's talking about what makes me, me. What makes you, you. What makes us God's children. What makes us Jesus' brother. And how, and sister, and how do we hold up? Hear the words of Paul from the 3rd chapter of Colossians. As God's chosen ones, holy and beloved, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience. Bear with one another, and if anyone has a complaint against another, forgive each other, just as the Lord has forgiven you. So you also must forgive. Above all, clothe yourselves with love, which binds everything together in perfect rule in your hearts, to which indeed you are called in the one body. And be thankful. Let the word of Christ dwell in you richly. Teach and admonish one another in all wisdom, and with gratitude in your hearts sing psalms, sing hymns, and spiritual songs to God. And whatever you do in word or deed, do everything in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God and the Father through him. This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. The garments of grace. That's what one commentator calls this section. I call it maybe threads for the new year. As we look forward, and Mark talked about, where'd Mark go? Mark messes me up. Talked about looking forward into the new year and resolutions. Well, Paul here is trying to help us put on new clothing and explain to us what that clothing is and how it will help us. And that's a far cry from Jack Lewis down at Julius Lewis trying to sell me a shirt with an alligator or a pant with HIS, because nobody really ever told me what that alligator meant. And I really didn't know why I had to have HIS on my pants. And I sure as heck didn't know why I wore a shoe that's called a Ouijan, because I didn't have any earthly idea what a Ouijan was. And I suspect strongly, when you were that age, nobody explained it to you. You know, it's just what everybody did. But the garments that we are to put on, that hopefully we will don ourselves with for the new coming year, Paul puts to us very clearly. And the first one there is a heart of pity, or as my translation says, it is compassion. And in the ancient world, oh my, did they need compassion. Because everything that's there, God made. People, flora, fauna, animals, the whole shooting match, God made. But the ancient Greeks, the ancient people, cared not one whit for animals. And suffering in animals just happened. There was no trying to take care of animals. Think about the sick and the afflicted that we know about in the Bible. Who was the one person who tried to minister to them? Jesus. Because they were laid at the wall, or at the pool, or at the entrance to the temple to do what? Beg. That was how they got along. You know, there was no compassion. There was no compassion. There was no caring for. There was no tending to the aged. And those that had anxiety problems, that had problems of the heart and the mind and the soul, there was nothing that was done for them. They had to shift for themselves. And it is not too much to say that the beginning of compassion, the beginning of me caring for you and you caring for each other as human beings, came into being with the advent of the ministry of Jesus Christ. Because before him, it was live and let live. And Jesus did what in the song we just sang, Amy? Showed us the way. Interesting. Very interesting. The second clothing that Paul instructs us to put on is the clothing of kindness. And Barclay, and I'm a big fan of William Barclay. If you haven't figured that out, I'm a big fan. Barclay says that the word for kindness in Greek is Christotes, and he calls this a lovely word for a lovely character. Now you have to think about kindness, and how does kindness manifest itself in a man or a woman or a boy or a girl, in any of us as human beings? Well, think about kindness as a virtue that is the manifestation of the golden rule, is that a man who is kind cares more about the good of his neighbor than he does for his own good. That's kindness. You know, his neighbor's good is as dear to him as the good of himself. The ancient historian, Josephus, says that Isaac was the perfect example of this kind of kindness, because think about it, those of you that know the story of Isaac, what did he do? He went and he dug wells, and then he just what? Gave them away. He dug the wells. He did the work. He had the work done. He dug the wells that provided life-giving water for people, but rather than argue about it and fight over it, he was more concerned in other people. And he gave those wells away. Christotes, kindness. You know, Simon the Pharisee was a good man. But Jesus, when he personifies, when he embodies kindness, is more than good, because he embodied Christos. I think of kindness, that there are some people that are kind, or some people that are good, but maybe they lack kindness. And as I studied this over the last week, the one person in my life that really jumped at me as who was good, very good, but I really honestly think lacked kindness, was Imelda Stanton. Now, Imelda Stanton was the principal of Idlewild School, and she had a real something for me. I don't know what it was. She had it in for me, because she had me come and visit her in the office a great deal of the time. And she was good, and she could talk to me, but she wasn't real kind about it. And when I left her office, I felt about that big, and I felt like I just really was not where I was supposed to be. So I tried to find someone who was the antithesis of